Dale Yonker, President of the Illinois Council of Chapters, representing the Military Officers Association of America. Now let's meet our candidates. Representing the Green Party, Ms. Paula Bradshaw. Representing the Republican Party, Mr. Jason Plummer. And representing the Democratic Party, Mr. Bill Enyard. At this time, I'll turn the podium over to Mr. Yonker.
Thank you, Rick. Ms. Bradshaw, Mr. Enyard, and Mr. Plummer, we're glad you accepted our invitation to come tonight. We weren't planning on all the competition from the ball games, but we're here to do important business for the Military Officers Association as well as our community and the country. I participated in a couple of the MOAA Storming the Hill activities, and they're in April each spring, where we visit with congressmen and senators in their offices, and I've attended both sessions of the 112th Congress, so I'll promise you that the MOAA will be back again next year and the year after, promoting the issues that are important to MOAA and the military community. So let's begin tonight then with the questions, and we'll begin with Ann to ask the first question. Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me. Opening statements. Ms. Bradshaw, you have the first, you have 2 minutes for your opening statement.
Well, thank you for inviting me. The main focus of this election seems to be the lack of jobs for everyone who wants to work. In response, the Republicans want to cut taxes again, even though the Reagan and the Bush-Obama tax cuts of the last 30 years have only created record inequality and budget deficits, not jobs. The Democrats think that giving tax credits to the 1% will induce them to invest some of the $2 trillion they have stashed in offshore banks, or stop them from shipping our industry overseas. Again, the past decades show this doesn't work. As a Green Party candidate, I want the federal government to step in and directly employ people to rebuild this country's infrastructure, protect our environment, and care for our people. Anyone who thinks that federal spending can't bring prosperity to a region need only look at the impact of military spending. Whenever it is suggested that money be withdrawn from military spending in order to balance the budget, howls of indignation arise from those who would lose their jobs. Yes, when it comes to the military, it is openly acknowledged that government spending creates employment. This power to create prosperity should not be limited to military spending. We need to invest in sustainable transportation, renewable energy, and the basic needs of our citizens, such as food, water, shelter, health, and education. Half of our population now lives in or near poverty. We can do better. We must do better. And if I'm elected as your next representative, I will work to ensure that government focuses on meeting our needs here at home.
Thank you. Mr. Plummer?
Well, thank you very much to the Southwestern Illinois chapter of the Military Officers Association. It's great to be here before this group, and thank you for everyone that you all represent. You know, I look out in the crowd, I see quite a few people who have served this country, and I'd like to take a minute to thank all of them. If you've served in the armed forces, will you please stand up for 1 second? When you crisscross this district has 12 counties, and we face many issues. We face many issues at the national level. We face many issues here within the 12th Congressional District. An issue I talk about all the time is the ridiculously high unemployment rate that we encounter. When you look at the natural resources, the human resources, our geographic location, if you look at all the opportunity that sits before us, yeah, you look at the unemployment rate that we face, there's absolutely no excuse for it. It's not because of a lack of resources or a lack of human talent, it's because of poor public policy. We've laid out a plan, I think, to address those issues, but we're here to talk about, today we're here to talk about a different set of issues. One thing you always hear me talk about on the campaign trail is what are the core functions of government? How do you prioritize your spending? And I always say the number one core function of government is national security. The number one core function of government is to protect our nation and protect our citizens. So we're here today to discuss a different set of issues than it's typical during most of our debates. I couldn't think of a better group to discuss these issues with. When you look at what's happening overseas, I would argue that we have serious problems just as we do here domestically. When we look at what's happening in the Middle East, when we look at what's happening with Russia and China, when we look at what's happening with our military, and the spending that we need to keep up in order to maintain the strong military that we have, in order to make sure that our military continues to be the eminent military of the world, we face serious problems. And I'm very frustrated and very concerned with politicians in Washington that use the military as a bargaining chip in policy discussions. We need to make sure that we support our military, we support our men and women in uniform, and we don't put them at risk because of partisan politics. I look forward to discuss these issues here today.
Thank you. And Mr. Andrew?
Good evening. I'd like to thank MOA for sponsoring this debate. I'd also like to thank the audience for attending our last job interview before the election. This debate will focus largely on foreign affairs and military issues. These are particularly critical issues with Scott Air Force Base a few miles away, with its tremendous impact on our national defense as well as our local economy. All three of us want the best for our country. All three of us want the best for our district. All three of us will work very hard if elected. But there are stark choices among the candidates' views, their credentials, their experience, their leadership, and their proven ability to work with all people. I've had the opportunity to serve our great nation for nearly 36 years in both enlisted and officer ranks. I've served with the soldiers and airmen of the latest, greatest generation. With that humbling opportunity has come learning experiences in places as diverse as Kosovo, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Egypt, and particularly our NATO ally, Poland. I've also had the opportunity to attend the senior executive programs at both Harvard University and the George Marshall Center in Garmisch, Germany. These experiences will help me make the serious decisions that need to be made to represent the people of the 12th Congressional District. That foreign policy experience, with years of experience working with both federal and state legislators to get things accomplished, as well as 3 decades of private sector business experience, add greatly to my ability to accomplish things in Washington, D.C. I'd like to use these experiences, these serious credentials, to continue my service to our great nation and our district in Congress. I urge you to listen carefully so that you can determine for yourself which candidate will best represent the families, the working people, the service members, the taxpayers of our district. At the conclusion of tonight's debate, I'm going to ask you to vote for that person. Thank you.
Thank you to all the candidates for the opening statements, and now we'll begin the question period. Just a reminder, the minute 15 seconds response time, so Anne, you'll have the first question.
Good evening. What would you do to ensure quality health care for those who currently serve or who have served in the military? And in your response, please be sure to include both physical and mental health concerns.
Well, I think that right now our military doctors and nurses are some of the best in the entire country. And thanks to all the wars that the United States is engaged in, we get really good at trauma care. So me as an emergency room nurse, I have benefited from all the injured and wounded soldiers in the various wars that the United States is engaged in. So I think that the military doctors and nurses that work in combat are the best. And they don't have to worry about budget constraints or anything. This is what I hear from nurses that used to be in the military. Anything they want, they got the best of care for everything. The VA, I think it does pretty well for the people it serves. It doesn't serve enough people. I mean, a lot of people are not allowed to go to the VA. And I would definitely support Jefferson Barracks, and maybe we need more than one mental hospital for people who come back psychologically damaged from multiple tours of duty. Definitely I think that we should support the veterans psychologically, and I think that all of their needs should be met, especially, you know, I talked to vets who had 20 vaccinations. You know, they just line them up well, they tell me that they think they're experimented on. These people should be taken care of. Sorry?
Why? Thank you. I agree with Paula. In an overseas situation, in a war zone, our men and women in uniform have phenomenal care, and that care continues to progress and get better and better. But what happens when they come back home? Our VA system, I think, is inadequately funded. I think that we have a perfect example here in the 12th Congressional District. If you look at what has taken place at the VA in Marion, Illinois, a very, very tragic story, very, very bad problems. And we need to make sure that we have elected officials that pay attention to these things and make sure that our men and women in uniform are being taken care of. They should be the nation's priority for everything that they've done for this country. However, it's not just the men and women in uniform that we're talking about. I think we also need to keep in mind their families. And that's something that's being underreported right now, but something I'm very passionate about. You know, if you look at the TRICARE situation right now, and the budget cuts that are about to take place, and the terrible situation that puts our men and women in uniform and their families in, it's absolutely horrible. One reason why I oppose Obamacare is because Obamacare actually takes an axe to TRICARE and really takes away a lot of benefits from the families of our servicemen and women. Right now, 210,000 dependent children of men and women in uniform are not receiving the TRICARE benefits they need because of the increased fees Obamacare puts on that program. We need to make sure the men and women in uniform and their families are taken care of.
Mr. Inyer?
You know, as the budget pressures increase, it has been and there will continue to be pressure on TRICARE because of the increasing cost. And DOD has struggled mightily to keep those costs down. And I think what we need to do is ensure that we do not increase those costs to either the active component or to the reserve component members, because those costs amount to a deduction in the active and reservist pay. Additionally, we need to improve access to the Guard and Reserve members so that they can have a continuum of care. We don't want to have a situation where there are lapses in coverage, which we've seen happen with increasing mobilization of Guard and Reserve forces over the last 10 years. Another issue is the transition when you're going from active duty military service to veteran status. And we need to have a smooth transition from the TRICARE system to the veterans healthcare system. When we talk about the veterans healthcare system, one of the things, there are problems clearly at the Marion facility, and we've heard of problems at the Cochrane facility in St. Louis. I found that when I was...
Okay, second question, then I will ask it. Will you support the House Defense Bill that reduces Pentagon proposed increases in TRICARE pharmacy copay amounts for fiscal 2013? And do you think the House provision that require TRICARE for Life beneficiaries to use the mail order system for at least 1 year to refill any maintenance medications is a reasonable plan to pay for this action by the House? Let's start with Ms. Bradshaw. Okay.
Okay. Well, first off, I do not believe that that's a reasonable plan. I don't think that the families of our servicemen and women should be put into these weird situations because things are being kind of forced upon them, one size fits all. It's a real problem. I'm an intelligence officer in the Navy Reserves at Scott Air Force Base, and that is a topic of conversation. The changes are taking place within TRICARE on a daily basis with our men and women in uniform. It's a real problem. I also will not support legislation that you referred to that would increase the cost of TRICARE. Right now, I think we have a real problem in terms of the benefits and the pay that our men and women in uniform receive. In order to ensure the fact that we have a strong military, in order to encourage retention of quality people, we need to make sure that the pay and benefits the men and women in uniform receive is comparable to that in the private sector. We see right now their pay is not comparable to those folks in the private sector. And if we add additional healthcare costs onto them and to their families, we're actually going to harm not just the families, but the quality of our military. So we need to make sure that we oppose those provisions.
Okay. Would you repeat the first half of the question, please?
Yes. Will you support the House Defense Bill, that's the one the House passed, that reduces the Pentagon proposed increases in TRICARE pharmacy copay amounts for fiscal 2013?
Yes, the reduction in the copay amounts to money back in the service member's pocket. So I would be in support of that. And I believe that MOA had agreed to a modest increase last year. However, the Pentagon and the DOD dramatically increased the copay. So as a result of that, I believe that the House bill rolls it back more in line with an appropriate number. Now, the question is, of course, anytime you're modifying the budget, then you have to find a way to pay for it. And so the question is, what is an appropriate way to pay for that increased or that decreased cost to the service member? And the proposal is that those people on maintenance medications, hypertensive medications, the medication that you take day after day, month after month, typically doesn't change very much. And that's a pretty common requirement in civilian prescription plans as well. And if it's not a requirement, then they give you an incentive to do that. That's a relatively easy way to recoup the money that would otherwise be lost. And DOD, of course, is under tremendous pressure. And I see I have a red light.
Ms. Bradshaw?
Yeah, I would say that increasing co-pays is not the right way to help balance the budget. All this is typical of what the government does. It takes what should be paid for by all of society and just throws it on the backs of individuals in need. That's the same thing as Obamacare and so many other things, our national parks and so many of our, what should be a shared expense is thrown on the backs of those who are most in need. So yeah, I would say the copay should not be increased. The mail order meds doesn't sound that onerous to me, as long as there was some sort of way that if someone ran out of their meds early, they could go to the pharmacy and get it and have it covered by TRICARE. Other than that, having if you're you're going to be on the same drug for the next 3 years, getting it by mail doesn't seem that onerous to me. So I would go along with that.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. During the 2011 debt crisis, U.S. debt was more than $14.3 trillion when the level of borrowing reached the statutory limit. Foreign governments hold almost 46% of all U.S. debt held by the public at more than $4.5 trillion. According to the U.S. Treasury, China is the largest foreign holder at roughly $1.2 trillion in bills, notes, and bonds. Admiral Mike Mullen, prior to his retirement as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, characterized our national debt as, quote, as the biggest threat to U.S. security, close quote. To what extent, if any, does this present a danger to our national economy in general and our security in particular, and what, if anything, could or should be done to address this issue?
I was in a briefing with Admiral Mullen when he was the Joint Chief of Staff about 1.5 years ago when he first broached that topic, and that was before he released it to the public. And he told us that the greatest threat to American security is not China, the greatest threat is not Russia, it is not Iran, but rather it's the fiscal crisis that we're facing. The amazing thing is that the entire world still rushes to lend money to us at very, very low interest rates, at 1% or so. If you go out and try to get a decent return on your IRA, you know you're not going to get a very large interest rate. Government bonds are incredibly cheap. However, interest rates will certainly go back up at some point in time. And as interest rates go up, as the deficit increases, that's going to consume an ever larger part of our budget. So clearly we have to get this fiscal situation under control. And there are two ways to do it. Number one, you increase revenue. And number two, you cut government spending. You increase revenue by increasing jobs, more people paying taxes, and also the tax cuts that went into effect for millionaires under the Bush era are going to have to be eliminated. Certainly, I think the President's proposal at $250,000 and above is
Well, the reason foreign governments own so much of our debt is because we spend so much money on other people and on other countries. For instance, Saudi Arabia owns a lot of our debt too. That's because we can't seem to get off fossil fuels. So we buy oil and the dollar is the world's reserve currency. So all oil trade especially is in dollars. So they have all these dollars. What are they going to do with them? They invest them in treasury bonds. Same with China. China wouldn't hold so much of our debt if we hadn't let our corporations pack up our industrial machinery and move it over to China so they could profit from Chinese cheap labor. We wouldn't have so many dollars going to China, and China wouldn't hold so much of our debt because that's what they do with the excess dollars. They buy treasury bonds. So if you seriously want to stop foreign governments from owning so much of our debt, you'd quit shipping our machinery over to China and you'd get off oil so that you wouldn't have to buy so much oil from Saudi Arabia. Any other suggestions are not realistic. It's the only realistic thing you can do is keep our jobs here in the United States and switch to renewable energy and sustainable transportation.
Well, our fiscal crisis is absolutely a major national security issue. Look, this year we're going to spend $3.5 trillion. $2.5 trillion of the $3.5 trillion goes to Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and interest on the debt. That leaves $1 trillion for everything else the federal government does: military, infrastructure, education, FBI, IRS, you name it. Our deficit's going to be over $1.2 trillion this year, which means you can eliminate everything the federal government does, including the military, and we would still run a deficit. That is a huge problem. Clearly, we've got spending problems. We've had 4+ years of $1 trillion+ deficits. We need to send people to Washington, D.C. They're going to aggressively tackle this issue. In order to tackle this issue, you've got to admit there's a problem. Once you admit there's a problem, you've got to solve it. How do you solve it? You cut government spending and you drive more revenue to Washington. How do you drive more revenue to Washington? You do it the same way JFK did it. You do it the same way Ronald Reagan did it. You lower tax rates, you create an economic environment that incentivizes work, saving, and investment. You get more people participating in the economy, more people getting paychecks, more people paying taxes. You drive more revenue. You eventually begin to solve the deficit problem. Once you take care of the deficits, you can tackle the $16+ trillion national debt that we have.
Thank you. Now the next round will be begin with Ms. Bradshaw.
Thank you. Please discuss your views on the role of women in the military. In your response, make specific suggestions for career advancement for women serving in the military, as well as for putting into place safeguards against violence on women, such as sexual assault, while serving.
Well, that is a problem, isn't it? There's some large proportion of women serving in the military who report that they've been assaulted by their fellow soldiers, as well as I think in Okinawa, everyone's on lockdown right now because the soldiers just attacked and raped another Okinawan child, but that's not really a good question. I think that women should have equal opportunity to serve in the military, although I think that they shouldn't be ripped away from their young children to do so, which happens a lot. There's no way that you can properly nurture an infant if you're 10,000 miles away and the infant's being taken care of by family members. So I think you have to realize that there are needs that children have that only mothers can take care of, and that you should make provisions for that. As far as the sexual violence, I guess you're going to have to make sure that women can go to the bathroom at night alone and other things like that. You just have to make sure that women are properly protected.
This issue has definitely been a problem. It's a problem that the military takes very seriously. They're working to eradicate, but it's far from solved. Women should have every opportunity in the military to participate, to advance, like they should in the private sector, anywhere else. I think one thing that we really need to look at is, I talked about across this district, there's a lot of issues we're facing. One issue we're facing is the extremely high unemployment rate, 10.5% in this district. One thing that people overlook is 1 in 5 women, veterans, that are out of the military now are unemployed. 20% are unemployed. They can't find work. So we need to make sure that women are being taken care of while they serve this nation, but we also need to make sure that once they honorably leave the military, that there's opportunities waiting for them. And I talk all the time about the fact that when our military folks exit the service and they go into the private sector, the opportunities don't exist for them. The problem is much more severe for our female veterans, and that's something that we've talked about expansively in this campaign, and it's something we're going to continue to focus on. Women deserve every opportunity in the service, but we also need to make sure they have opportunity when they exit the service as well.
Thank you. Mr. Amy.
Thank you. Women play an incredibly important part in our military. I had the opportunity while I was serving as the commander of the Illinois National Guard to promote the first Army National Guard female colonel to brigadier general. Colonel Alicia Tate-Nadeau, who's currently serving in Israel, has been confirmed to the United States Senate for promotion to brigadier general. I also had the opportunity to promote the first Air National Guard colonel in the Illinois Air National Guard, Colonel Marcy Miller, who has been confirmed to the United States Senate for promotion to brigadier general in the Air National Guard. I think that clearly, in terms of ensuring that women are not subject to attack or to discrimination or to other problems, requires command involvement. Commanders must take appropriate steps to ensure that that type of thing doesn't happen. What I found when I was commanding was that if you inspected something, then it got fixed. When I first took command of the Guard, we had a problem in the recruiting division. Recruiters were abusing recruits. I put a stop to it. I fired some folks. I reduced them in rank. We took care of that problem. So commanders.
Okay, the next round, Mr. Plummer, you can do the first answer. Will you support the defeat of a Senate-proposed special commission to consider changes to military retirement and compensation systems that allow the administration to pick all the commissioners, bar participation by current or recent military association representatives, and require a congressional vote on the proposals with little debate and no amendments?
Can you repeat the first half of that?
Yeah. It's a Senate-proposed special commission that would make changes to the military retirement and compensation systems.
Right. I just want to make sure you're referring to the commission, not legislation.
Right.
Absolutely would oppose that. The fact that our elected officials think that they can put a commission like that into position without having the real experts involved in the process is something that it evades common sense. You know, something I talk about all the time on the campaign trail is we have a very diverse district. We have a very diverse economy. We have a very diverse geographic location. Coal, oil, gas, Scott Air Force Base, SAU Carbon, you name it. And nobody can be an expert in all of those things. We need to make sure that our elected officials listen to the experts in each individual field. And what the Senate proposal you are referring to, that the conversation around that really started over a year ago now, is exactly a perfect example of the problem I'm referring to. We need to make sure that our elected officials are listening to the experts in each field, and when it comes to this commission, they're clearly not doing that.
Mr. Amier?
Thank you. That's a clear example of Congress abdicating its responsibilities. That's an expedited BRAC type of hearing, BRAC type of commission, and congressmen and senators get paid to make tough decisions. And this is an example of Congress not wanting to take the political heat to make a tough decision. So I would be opposed to that. I believe that clearly Congress will be tasked with reviewing those, and Congress will have to make that tough decision. And if a congressman or a senator is not willing to take a stand, not willing to make a tough decision, then they shouldn't be a congressman. We're, after all, running to make decisions on behalf of our nation, and that's what we get paid to do.
Thank you. Ms. Bradshaw?
I think it's always better when you have more input and you have more voices in any decision. So turning these kind of decisions over to a small committee of hand-picked people probably is not in the best interest of the people, the constituents that they're serving. So yeah, I would say that it's probably best to leave it in the hands of the full one and not just turn it over to a small committee.
Thank you. Okay, the next round then, Mr. Enyart, you'll be the first responder, and Morris will ask the question.
On January 17th, 1961, President Dwight David Eisenhower warned in his farewell speech to the American public of the establishment of a military-industrial complex, or perhaps more aptly described as a military-industrial congressional complex, which refers to policies and monetary relationships amongst legislators, the National Armed Forces, and the defense industrial base that supports them. Political corruption often occurs within this context. Given our current recession and our vital interests around the world, do you support more spending on defense in general? And what, if anything, could or would you do to deal with the military-industrial complex in particular?
Professor, that's a very complex question, but I'll try to answer it as quickly as I can. Historically, after every war, we have reduced defense spending. The war in Iraq has wound down. The war in Afghanistan is winding down, or appears to be winding down. The world is nonetheless still a dangerous place. We have the example of Syria with multiple conflicts going on in Africa, although we're not heavily engaged in those. However, I believe that there clearly is room to reduce defense spending. You know, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about 6 weeks ago where we built a base for the Afghans at the cost of $1 billion, but it was built to American standards. It had stainless steel refrigerators. It had stainless steel gas stoves. Well, the Afghans didn't have the electricity to run the refrigerators and didn't have the gas to run the stoves. Afghans don't cook on natural gas. They cook on clay wood-burning stoves. We spent $1 billion to build a base they refused to use. Clearly there's waste. I think that based on the credentials and my experience, I have the capacity to go in and question defense contractors and defense DoD leaders to ensure that waste doesn't continue in government programs. There's waste in every government program. The military is not exempt from that. What we must do is eliminate the waste without cutting into the muscle and the bone.
Thank you. Ms. Bradshaw?
Well, as I alluded to in my opening statement, the military-industrial complex does indeed permeate our country, where they pass out these defense contracts so that every single congressional district in the country has some military defense contractors that scream like stuck pigs if anyone says let's reduce the budget. However, there's so much waste, fraud, and abuse in the military budget. For instance, in September 2001, Donald Rumsfeld told Congress that the Pentagon just couldn't account for $2.2 trillion that they had gotten and they lost somehow. I guess stuff happens. And the Pentagon also has done business with contractors who were accused and convicted of defrauding the U.S. government. Hundreds of contractors got $1.1 trillion, and this is after they were convicted of defrauding the U.S. government, and they were rewarded with more contracts. And, you know, they paid like $1 million fine. So let's just see here. You're a military contractor, and you're going to defraud the government, and you're going to get $1 trillion, and you pay $1 million in fines? That's a pretty good deal, I'd say.
Thank you. And Mr. Plummer?
Well, I think in all programs, not just government, I mean, you can go into most probably large corporations and you can find waste, and you definitely need to send people that are going to make sure that we spend our money as efficiently and as effectively as possible. But I'd like to go back in history a little bit and paint a picture and remind people, you know, we were in the Gulf War, and upon exiting the Gulf War, military spending decreased pretty dramatically. We didn't replace the equipment. We didn't take care of a lot of the veterans. We had serious problems. And then 9/11 hit, and when 9/11 hit, we ramped up military spending very quickly. It wasn't just because we were going to Afghanistan right after 9/11. It's because we had to catch up with all of the equipment that we cannibalized throughout the 1990s. We had to ramp the military up to get it up to grade so that we could go overseas and participate in these conflicts. So I think when we're exiting when we've exited Iraq, and we may or may not be exiting Afghanistan, depending on what news report you read, as these folks come home, we can't immediately just cut off funding. We need to make sure we replace our military equipment. We need to make sure that it stays up to date. We need to make sure that our men and women in uniform are taken care of. And I have a great fear that if we send people out there with this idea that we can just slash the budget because we're not overseas, we're going to put ourselves in the same position that we were in the 1990s when 9/11 hit. We weren't prepared. Our military has to be prepared. Our men and women in uniform have to be taken care of.
Thank you. Now, Ms. Bradshaw, you'll be the first to respond. Again, Dan.
Okay. Do you consider being a political moderate a bad thing? And how would you personally, as a member of Congress, work with those who have very different views from your own, whether it's President Obama, President Romney, or other members of Congress? To what extent would you be willing to cross the aisle to work with those people who are different, have different views on the very tough issues that are facing our country today?
Well, of course, as a Green, I wouldn't be on either side of the aisle. I'd be in the middle of the aisle, and they'd have to come to me, wouldn't they? You know, I am capable of working with other people. I do it all the time, and I'm pretty moderate in my views. I don't believe in, you know, mass murder. I don't believe in slashing budgets. I don't believe in blowing up mountaintops. I'm a pretty moderate person. I'm kind of conservative because I want to conserve the natural beauty of this country and the planet that we all share. So I consider myself a moderate, and I look forward to going to Congress and having everybody come to me.
Mr. Plummer?
I'm a conservative too, Paul. No, I really appreciate the question, because I think that it's a little bit deeper than just, are you a moderate? Because you can go a different direction. There's policy positions being moderate, and then there's just how you carry yourself and how you act. Are you willing to work with people across the aisle? Are you willing to work with people up and down the ballot? And what we have in Washington, D.C. right now is we've got a whole lot of people on the left and a whole lot of people on the right, not a lot of people that are middle of the road that are willing to sit down and talk with folks. You know, I think you need to send someone to Washington, D.C. from this district, because this is a very middle of the road district. And that's something that should be kept in mind. The way they redraw districts these days, most are either real left or real right. The representative represents their very left or very right district. This district is a centrist district, and who we send out there must represent a moderate district. You're looking at a person right now who has stood up to the Republican Party and has talked about things that they failed in. I don't think all Republicans are good or bad. I don't think all Democrats are good or bad. We need to send people out there that are willing to say, look, the Farm Bill is a problem, and House leadership needs to be held accountable to it. But we need to send people out there that are willing to really hold both parties accountable. I look forward to doing that. I'm not beholden to anybody when I go to Washington, D.C. I'm not going out there to represent a party. I'm going out there to represent a district that is in bad need of representation.
Thank you. Mr. Anya?
Thank you. It's interesting. I received a mailer today from Mr. Plummer's campaign. Actually, I guess it was sent from the Republican Party of Illinois, but it said that Mr. Plummer is the only true conservative. So, but when we talk about moderates, I don't think moderate's a dirty word at all. I like to think of myself as a pragmatist. You know, I'm a guy who for 30 years now has been getting the job done. When I was serving as the commander of the Guard, I had to regularly testify in front of legislative committees and legislative commissions. I regularly had to go out to the Hill and meet with senators and congressmen. And, you know, it really didn't cross my mind as to whether they were Republican or Democrat. I was there to get a job done, sat down with them, talked to them, told them about the needs, told them what needed to be done, and managed to accomplish the mission. And that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm out to do when I go to Washington, D.C. Is to get the mission accomplished and to work with both sides of the aisle and do what's right for all of the people of this district as well as this great nation.
Thank you, sir. The next round then, Mr. Anya, you'll be the first responder, and Morris will have the question.
The United States has had a rather long and often undistinguished history of nation building requiring the use of military forces in many regions of the world under the guise of the national interest or facilitating democratic ideals. what factors do you believe constitutes the national interest requiring the placement of our young military personnel in harm's way? And do you consider protection of Middle Eastern oil fields in our national interest?
That's a lot of question for a minute and 15 seconds, Dr. Taylor. First of all, let me just say that in any given situation, the very last response should be the military response. I've had to train, equip, and send the orders, sending young men and women into combat. That is a very serious responsibility, and it is one that Congress is burdened with. And I think that clearly in all of our national endeavors, the last thing that we do is go to war. Now, clearly we have a national interest in our energy security, and that's why we need to build energy security here. We need to develop the coal fields. We need to develop fuels from coal right here in Illinois. That can be done and should be done. We need a sound, secure energy policy, a long-term energy policy. We haven't done that, just as we haven't done a long-term transportation plan or a long-term farm bill. That's why Congress needs to work together to get these things accomplished.
Thank you. Mr. or Ms. Bradshaw?
We have been told since 1972 that we need to break our addiction to oil. And instead, we've used more and more and more oil every year. And when we talk about our oil interests, it's just too bad it happens to be under other people's sand, doesn't it? So we feel the need to go over there and dominate other countries, invade other countries, support brutal dictators as long as they give us their oil. I think that our national security definitely means that we have to get off of oil and onto renewable energy. And coal, of course, is no substitute for oil. Oil is a very great substance. Too bad we blew it all in 100 years. It's compressed energy in a very portable medium, and it's easy to burn, and it gets us around. And we've built our entire infrastructure on cheap oil. Well, for the last 40 years, we haven't had cheap oil. It's gotten more and more expensive. So we need to quit trying to take other people's oil and develop forms of transportation and infrastructure that will allow us to quit going over there and killing other people for their oil.
Thank you. Mr. Plummer?
Well, I think that the decision to use military force in any situation is a very serious decision. I think we need to make sure that, as I said in my opening statement, we go back to what are those core functions of government. The core functions of government are national security, protecting the homeland and our citizens. I'm not a believer in nation building. However, I do realize that there's a lot of problem areas in the world, and I realize that our enemies are actively engaged in those processes, and the United States cannot unilaterally withdraw from what's taking place throughout the world through diplomatic discussions and so on and so forth, and retreat from these territories, because our enemies will gain influence, our enemies will gain these territories, our enemies will gain the relationships that we need to survive as a nation. So it's very important that we stay engaged in terms of foreign policy, in terms of on the global front. In terms of oil fields, I don't believe we're engaged in any wars for oil, but I do think the national security is very tightly aligned with our energy policy, and we see an administration right now that's decimating America's energy. Anybody that supports this administration does not support Keystone XL. They do not support coal. They do not support the domestic drilling for natural gas and oil. We need to make sure we have an all-the-above energy policy so that we're not forced to engage in these other.
Okay. The final round of questions then would be Ms. Bradshaw. You begin. Will you support changing a provision in TRICARE that requires the Pentagon to charge families for the full cost of additional health care coverage for adult children until their 26th birthday? For your information, the health care law requires insurance plans offered by civilian employers, including plans for federal government workers, to allow parents to keep children enrolled on family policies until their 26th birthday. The plans aren't permitted to charge a separate fee for each coverage, for such coverage.
Of course, I support expanding Medicare for all, or the single-payer system, which would mean that your child is supported at age 26 and at age 20, or has access to health care at age 26 and at age 27 and above. So I think that if we had a single-payer system, a Medicare for all system, we wouldn't have to worry about our 26-year-olds suddenly losing health care. As far as TRICARE goes, I do think that the children of military, people serving in the military, should be allowed to be on TRICARE until they're 26. That's only fair. If everybody else in the country has the so-called benefit, that the children of the military should also be allowed to stay on without extra charge.
Mr. Plummer?
I'd absolutely support changing it. I think it's embarrassing. I think it's absolutely ridiculous that our men and women in uniform are really the only ones that are forced to pay an extra charge to keep their children on their plans. You know, my opponent here earlier said that we need to make sure we don't pass these costs on to the men and women in uniform. Well, that's exactly what Obamacare does. In fact, there was an amendment, or there was a legislation inserted into Obamacare that ensured that folks that are on TRICARE have to pay an additional about $200 for their dependents 26 and younger to keep them on these plans. Private sector plans don't do this, other federal plans don't do this, only our men and women in uniform. That's exactly what Obamacare does. Yesterday he said the real problem with Obamacare is the fact that our president didn't market it and didn't explain it well enough to the American people. The problem with Obamacare is it cut $716 billion from Medicare. It's the largest tax increase on the middle class in American history. The problem with Obamacare is it forces our men and women in uniform to pay an extra fee just to keep their children on the plans that everybody else gets for free. It's absolutely ridiculous. I'd support changing that and repealing Obamacare and replacing it with true health care reform.
Thank you. Yes, I would support repealing that. That clearly is an unfair provision, and the provision should be identical to that in civilian health care plans as well as in other federal health care plans. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now we can have 2-minute closing statements from each of the candidates, and following the rotation then, Mr. Plummer, you would start with your 2-minute closing.
Well, I really do appreciate everybody coming out here. I know there's football games, I know there's baseball games, I know it's a little cold out, but it's very important that elected officials have the opportunity, candidates for office have the opportunity to get in front of voters. It's more important that the voters have the opportunity to see their candidates, to see where they truly stand on the positions, to hold their feet to the fire. You know, my opponent earlier said congressmen and senators get paid to make tough decisions. I've crisscrossed this district doing town halls and meet and greets in all 12 counties, getting in front of large audiences, talking about where I stand on each and every issue. I'm not a question mark. Someone that goes to Washington, D.C. is going to be making very tough decisions. We need to make sure that those decisions, when made, represent the constituents that send those folks to Washington. We've got military-related, foreign policy-related discussions and decisions that have to be made. We have a lot of domestic decisions that have to be made. This nation's facing serious problems. We touched on the fiscal crises we're facing, but here in Illinois 12, we're facing ridiculous unemployment rates. Scott Air Force Base is doing everything it can to participate and be vibrant in the local economy, but Scott Air Force Base alone won't get it done. We need to make sure that we have regulatory policies and tax policies in place that create incentives for people to work, to save, to invest, to participate in the economy so that people in Southern Illinois can find quality jobs. We need to make sure that we send advocates to Washington, D.C. that aren't here just to preserve Scott Air Force Base, but they're here to grow Scott Air Force Base because of the important role it plays in our national security. We don't know who's going to win the presidential race. We don't know who's going to win the Senate race. But the folks in southwestern Illinois have a real opportunity to have their voice heard, who they want to be in the U.S. House of Representatives. Do they want Nancy Pelosi and a rubber stamp for Barack Obama and his agenda? Or do they want someone that's going to stand up for the conservative values of the conservative southwestern Illinois 12th Congressional District? I'm proud to be representing a lot of good, hardworking people. I'm proud to be out talking to voters, and I really encourage everyone to stay engaged, to stay educated, and get out and vote on November 6th. Thanks for being here.
I realize full well that the longer I talk, the longer it delays you from watching a Cardinal victory. So this will be very brief. My father's name is engraved on one of the granite slabs in the Veterans Memorial in Belleville. At the top of that piece of granite are the words, duty, honor, country. That's the West Point motto. I ask for your vote so that I may continue in my duty with honor to our country. Thank you.
Members of Congress take an oath to defend the Constitution. It appears that our current Congress hasn't actually read it. I have. I know that Congress has the power to declare war, not an imperial president. The House of Representatives appropriates funds, not a gang of 12 appointed by party bosses. They must publish an accounting of their federal expenditures, not declare parts of it secret. We have the rights of free speech everywhere, not just in special zones behind barbed wire or police barricades. We have the right to peacefully assemble without being pepper sprayed or dragged to jail. We have the right to be secure in our papers and effects without having all communications spied upon or data mined by our government. We have a right to a public and speedy trial with the right to a lawyer and notice of the allegations and access to all the evidence, and not to be thrown into indefinite detention at the whim of the imperial president. It's time for the citizens of District 12 to send a real patriot to Washington, one who wants to defend the country from those who would destroy our liberties, those who would destroy our air, water, and soil, those who would leave our citizens destitute, homeless, and hungry in order to increase the profits of the economic royalists. It's time to send someone to Washington who isn't beholden to party bosses, to stand up for the people of this country. That's why I'm running, so please vote for me on November 6th.
I wish to thank our three candidates, Ms. Paula Bradshaw, Mr. Jason Plummer, Mr. Bill Inyard, for your participation this evening. I wish to thank our three moderators, Dr. Ann Collins, Dr. Morris Taylor, and Mr. Dale Yonker for their sacrifice. Additionally, I'd like to thank the O'Fallon Township High School for the use and setup of their auditorium, and to our audience for your interest to the issues affecting our community. November 6th is Election Day. I encourage everyone to please take the time to vote. It's a very important election. This concludes this evening's debate. Please drive home safely. Good night.